Welcome to Grandpa Explains. Settle in now. Pull the blanket up to your chin, let your shoulders sink down away from your ears, and let the day you just had drift somewhere behind you where it can't reach. There's nothing left to do tonight, nothing to fix, nothing to answer, nothing to remember. Just my voice and a slow, quiet story, the kind meant to be listened to with your eyes already closed. Let your breathing get long and easy. In and out. That's it. Tonight I want to tell you a story about two little words. Two words you've said 1,000 times without ever once stopping to wonder where they came from. You've used them to describe your friends. You've used them to describe yourself, probably at a party, or an excuse to leave one. The words are introvert and extrovert. Soft words. Ordinary words, the kind that slip off the tongue so easily you'd swear they'd always been there, worn smooth by everyday use like river stones. But here's the first small, strange thing, and it's the kind of thing that makes a good bedtime story, because it turns something familiar just slightly on its side. Almost everyone believes those two words were invented by one man, a Swiss doctor named Carl Gustav Jung. And that is not quite true, not the way people think it is, because the words themselves are older than Jung, much older. By the time Jung was even born, those syllables had already been floating around the English language for roughly 300 years. Let that sit for a moment. 300 years. The roots go all the way back to Latin, that old ancestor tongue that hides inside so much of what we say. Intro, meaning inward, toward the inside. Extra, meaning outside, beyond, out there. And then a little verb, vertere, which simply means to turn. To turn. So introversion, at its bones, means a turning inward, and extraversion means a turning outward. That's all. A direction. A leaning. The way a plant on a windowsill leans toward the light, or the way a sleeping cat curls itself away from the room and toward its own warm middle. And people used those words long before anyone dreamed of using them to sort human beings into kinds. Back in the 16th and 17th centuries, you might find introversion in a book of religion, describing the soul turning inward toward God in prayer, folding away from the world to look for something holy in the quiet. Or you might find it in the writings of men studying light and lenses and the eye, describing the way something could be turned or bent inward. It was a plain, useful, working word. It had nothing to do with whether you liked parties. So if Jung didn't invent the words, what did he do? Here is the honest, more interesting truth, and it's the kind of truth that's better than the myth. Jung didn't coin the syllables, Jung coined the concept. He took two old, dusty, half-forgotten words, and he poured a brand new meaning into them. He filled those old cups with something they had never held before. And that new meaning caught fire. It spread across the whole world, from clinics in Zurich to living rooms and offices, and eventually to little quizzes on your phone. When you say I'm such an introvert tonight, you are speaking Jung's meaning, even though you are using a word that's older than the United States. He gave the word its modern soul. And here is a tiny detail, the kind Grandpa likes, because it's small and picturable, and it makes you feel like you're being let in on a secret. Jung's own spelling was not the one you know. He wrote it extravert, with an A. E-X-T-R-A. Extravert. The one turned toward the extra, the outside. That a spelling still survives in the technical corners of psychology, quietly, like an old family surname that only the eldest relatives remember how to spell. The version you know, extrovert, with an O, came later, through ordinary people using it in ordinary talk, the A softening into an O the way pronunciations wear down over the years. So the very word most people credit Jung with inventing is spelled a way most people have never seen. A word older than he was, spelled differently than we spell it, meaning something he had to invent. Isn't that a funny little knot? We'll gently untie the rest of it tonight. But I've gotten ahead of myself, the way old men do. Because the real question isn't just where the words came from. The real question is why. Why would a serious doctor, a man of medicine, spend the better part of 20 years building an enormous, strange, ambitious map of the human mind around two directions of turning? What could possibly push a person to sit down and try to sort out the whole architecture of the soul? The answer is a wound, a quarrel, a friendship that broke. Let me tell you about that slowly, because it's the beating heart of the whole thing, and it's the part almost no one ever hears. Settle a little deeper now. This is where the story really begins. At the start of the 20th century, the study of the mind was young and raw and thrilling, the way a new country is thrilling before all the roads are built. And at the centre of it stood a famous man in Vienna named Sigmund Freud. You've heard the name. Freud was the great pioneer, the man who insisted that beneath our polite daylight selves there was a whole dark ocean, an unconscious, full of buried wishes and old wounds and hungers we didn't dare admit to. He was brilliant and stubborn and magnetic, and around him gathered a circle of younger, hungry, gifted men who wanted to understand the mind the way he did. And the brightest of those younger men, the one Freud loved most and called his son, his heir, the crown prince who would carry the whole movement into the future, was Carl Jung. For a while the two of them were as close as a father and a son. They wrote each other long, feverish letters. They talked for hours, for whole days, until the candles guttered. Freud saw in Jung the future of everything he'd built. But there was another man in that early circle, too, a quieter, sharper, more prickly man named Alfred Adler. And Adler, over time, came to see the mind very differently than Freud did. Where Freud looked at a troubled person and saw buried desire, buried wanting, appetite pointed outward at the world and at other people, Adler looked at the very same troubled person and saw something else entirely. He saw a struggle for power. He saw a small, frightened self trying to make itself big. Adler believed that what drove us down at the root was a feeling of inferiority, a sense of being small or weak or not enough, and the whole restless striving to overcome that smallness, to climb, to matter, to be strong. Now hold those two ideas side by side in the dark for a moment, because this is the puzzle that changed everything. Freud says it's about desire reaching outward, toward objects, toward other people, toward the world outside you. Adler says no, it's about the self reaching inward, toward its own sense of smallness, its own hunger to be powerful and safe. Two great minds, two careful, rigorous, serious men. And they could take the very same suffering patient, the very same anxious, unhappy person lying on the very same couch, and one of them would explain that suffering entirely one way, and the other would explain it entirely the opposite way. And both of them would be certain. Both of them would have a mountain of cases and reasoning to back it up. That was the thing that would not let Jung sleep. Picture him lying awake with it, the way you might lie awake with a question that won't quiet down. How can this be? How can two intelligent, honest men look at the exact same human being and build two opposite theories of the mind, and each be so sure? Somebody had to be wrong, didn't they? That's how we usually think about it. One of them must have simply gotten it right, and the other gotten it wrong. But Jung had a stranger, deeper thought, a thought that turned the whole problem inside out, the way you'd turn a glove. What if neither of them was wrong? What if both theories were correct, but correct about their makers? What if Freud's theory, all that libido and desire pouring outward onto the world and other people, was true because that was simply the shape of Freud's own mind? Freud, Jung decided, was fundamentally turned outward. His whole way of seeing pointed away from himself and toward the object, toward the outer thing, toward other people. In Jung's new language, Freud was an extrovert. His psychology naturally described a psyche that lives out in the world. And Adler? Adler, with all his talk of the self, the striving self, the self trying to overcome its own inferiority, his whole theory referred everything back to the subject, back to the inner person, back to the I. Adler, Jung decided, was fundamentally turned inward. He was an introvert. And so, of course, his psychology described a psyche organized around the inner self and its private struggle. Do you feel how large that thought is? It means the quarrel between those two famous men was never really about the patient at all. It was about them. Each of them had built a theory of all human beings in the shape of his own type. Each had mistaken his own way of turning, inward or outward, for the truth about everyone. The extrovert wrote an extrovert's psychology and called it universal. The introvert wrote an introvert's psychology and called it universal. And the reason they could never agree, never in 1,000 years of arguing, was that they were standing on opposite sides of a divide so deep and so old that neither could even see it, because each was standing inside his own half of it. That was the seed. That was the wound that grew into the whole enormous theory. Jung looked at that unbridgeable argument between the man he'd loved like a father and the rival who saw everything backwards from that father, and he thought, there is a fault line running through human nature itself, a basic, dividing line between people who turn toward the inner world and people who turn toward the outer one. And if I don't map it, we will keep doing this forever, building our theories, our religions, our sciences, all of them secretly in the shape of our own hidden type, and calling the other half of humanity simply wrong. His friendship with Freud did not survive. That's the sad part, and it belongs in the story because Jung paid for this idea with something real. The two men, once as close as father and son, broke apart. The final rupture came in 1913. The letters stopped. The great friendship ended in coldness and hurt, and Jung was left, in a way, out in the cold, cut off from the movement he'd been meant to inherit. And in the long, hard, lonely years that followed that break, wrestling with his own mind, sometimes frighteningly so, he did the work that would become the book. It took him nearly a decade of watching, of listening to patient after patient, of reading across centuries, and in 1921 he published it. In the original German, its name was Psychologische Typen, psychological types. 2 years later, in 1923, it appeared in English, carried across the language barrier by a translator named H.G. Baynes, so that the English-speaking world could finally read it. Later, when all of Jung's writings were gathered together into his collected works, this book took its place as Volume 6. Remember that number, if you like, Volume 6, the way you'd remember which shelf a favourite old book lives on. And here is something worth knowing about that book. Something that explains why the popular version of all this is so thin, so flattened, so much less than what Jung actually meant. The book is enormous, 600 pages and more. But if you picked it up tonight, expecting it to open with "here are the personality types," you would be baffled. Because for the vast majority of those pages, Jung barely talks about introverts and extroverts at all in the way you'd expect. Instead, page after page, he goes wandering back through history. He's a man walking through a great museum, stopping at painting after painting, saying, "Look, here it is again. And here. And here." He goes back through theology and philosophy and poetry, hunting for this same dividing line between the inward-turned and the outward-turned. He finds it everywhere. He finds it in poets. He finds it in old religious quarrels between men who lived and died more than 1,000 years before him. He finds it in debates among medieval philosophers about the nature of reality itself. His argument, buried in all those pages, is quietly astonishing. This split, he's saying, this divide between the one who turns inward and the one who turns outward, is not some new discovery of modern psychology. It is one of the oldest, deepest, most recurring patterns in all of human thought. We have been dividing along this line and arguing across it for as long as we've been thinking at all. Jung didn't invent the pattern. He noticed that it had been there the whole time, wearing 100 different costumes, and he was the first to say plainly, "This is one thing. This is the same fault line over and over through all of history." Only at the very end of that huge book, in the final chapters, the 10th and the 11th, one giving a general description of the types and the other simply defining his terms one by one, only there does Jung finally lay out the system directly. The part everybody quotes is the last few chapters of a book almost nobody finishes. 500 pages of build-up, and the world took the last 50 and threw the rest away. Which is exactly why the thing you think you know about personality types is such a small, shrunken survivor of what was once a vast and strange idea. We kept the label and lost the cathedral it was hanging in. Now, before we go any further, I need to give you back one word, because Jung had to fight for it. And it matters. That word is libido. You may have heard that word before, and you may think you know what it means. In Freud's world, in the world of that famous father figure Jung broke away from, libido meant something very specific. It meant sexual energy, the drive of desire, of appetite, pointed at the body and its wanting. For Freud, that particular kind of energy was very nearly the engine of the whole mind. It was the fuel under everything, and this was one of the deep places where Jung simply could not follow him. Jung looked at the human mind, and he could not accept that all its energy, every last bit of the force that moves us, was really sexual at the root. So he did something bold, and a little rebellious, especially toward the man who had been like his father. He took Freud's word, libido, and he stretched it. He opened it up. In Jung's hands, libido stopped meaning sexual energy and started meaning something much wider, general psychic energy. The whole of it, all the life force of the mind, whatever its flavor, the energy you spend when you concentrate on a hard problem, the energy that lights up when you fall in love, yes, but also the energy that lights up when you're moved by a piece of music, or gripped by a book, or pulled toward a quiet room, or drawn out toward a crowd of friends. Just energy, the current that runs through the psyche and animates it, the way electricity runs through a sleeping house and keeps the little lights glowing even in the dark. And you can already see, can't you, why redefining that one word was itself part of the great split with Freud? If libido is only sexual energy, then Freud's whole map makes sense. But if libido is general psychic energy, all of it, everywhere, then suddenly you can ask a new and different question. Not what does this person desire, but which way does this person's energy flow? Inward, toward the subject, toward the private inner world, or outward, toward the object, toward the world and the people in it? Introversion and extraversion, at the very deepest level, are just the two answers to that question. They are the two directions that the river of psychic energy can run. Toward the inner shore, or toward the outer one. So that is where we are, as the story gets going. Two old words, older than the man who made them famous. A wound between three brilliant men. Freud turned outward, Adler turned inward, and Jung caught between them, unable to sleep for the puzzle of it. A great forgotten book, mostly a tour of history, with the famous part hidden at the very end. And a single stolen, stretched word, libido, reimagined as the pure energy of the mind, flowing one of two ways. And here, before I let you drift further down, I want to lay three little threads across the story. Three loose ends I'm going to leave dangling in the dark, and I promise you, as the night goes on, I'll come back and tie up every one. Sleep stories are better, with a few threads to hold. Here's the first thread. Everything I've told you so far, everything the world remembers, the introvert, the extrovert, the labels you wear, all of that is in a way the least important part of what Jung was reaching for. Because tucked deep inside his theory, there is a part of you that he said is at the very same time your greatest weakness and your only path to becoming whole. A clumsy, primitive, half-buried piece of your own personality that you neglect without even knowing you're neglecting it. And the strange, almost unbearable thing about it is this: the personality tests you know today, the popular ones, the ones with the 4 little letters, they took that part out. They deleted it. They kept the labels and threw away the one piece that Jung would have said actually mattered. We'll come back to that. Hold the thread. Here's the second thread. There is a reason. A real, structural, 100-year-old reason, written right into Jung's diagram of the mind, why you were so powerfully drawn, once, to the very person who now, some days, drives you completely out of your mind. The one who fascinated you precisely because they were so unlike you. The attraction and the exhaustion, Jung would say, come from the same root, the same single cause. And when I explain it to you later tonight, I think you'll recognize it. I think you'll go quiet for a second and think of a particular face. Hold that thread too, and here's the third, the smallest and the strangest. One of the ideas that grew out of all this, generations later, can be measured, actually measured, in a laboratory on the human body, with a single drop of lemon juice placed on the tongue. Personality, made visible not in a quiz but in saliva. It sounds like a joke. It isn't. I'll show you near the end. Hold all 3 threads loosely in your mind and then let them go, because you don't have to keep track of anything tonight. That's my job. I'll bring them all back around. For now, just rest with the big shape of it. A doctor who could not stop noticing that people seem to come in 2 great directions. One turned inward, gathering energy from the quiet inner world, sometimes overwhelmed by too much of the outer one. One turned outward, coming alive among people and things and events, sometimes lost and restless when left too long alone. Neither better, neither the correct way to be, just 2 ways the same river can run. And already, lying here, you might feel yourself starting to answer the question for your own self. Which way does my energy turn? When the long day finally ends, when the door closes and the world goes quiet, does something in you sink with relief into that quiet, refilling slowly like a well in the dark? Or does something in you go a little flat and lonely, reaching out toward a voice, a message, a plan for tomorrow with someone in it? There's no wrong answer. Jung would be the first to tell you there's no wrong answer. In fact, and this is a gentle little surprise I'll unwrap more fully later, Jung believed that most people aren't purely one or the other at all. Most of us live somewhere in the wide, comfortable middle. The pure introvert and the pure extrovert, he suggested, are rare, almost theoretical creatures. You and I and nearly everyone we know are some quiet blend, leaning one way, borrowing from the other. So don't lie there tonight trying to pin yourself to a single label. That was never really the point. That was never what the old man in Zurich was trying to do. What he was trying to do was bigger and kinder than a label. He was trying to draw a map of the whole inner country of a person, not to trap you inside one little region of it, but to show you the parts of yourself you've never visited. The rooms in your own house where you keep the lights off. Because Jung's real belief, the belief under all of this, the one the personality tests forgot, was that a whole person is not someone who has perfected their strong side. A whole person is someone who has finally turned, late in life maybe, and made peace with their weak one. But that is a thread for later. For now, let your mind go soft around the edges of the story. Let the names blur pleasantly. Freud turned outward toward the world. Adler turned inward toward the self. Jung, awake in the night between them, feeling the great fault line running under everything. Two Latin roots, intro and extra, and a small verb that means to turn, a river of energy that can run toward the inner shore or the outer one, and three quiet threads left hanging in the dark, waiting for me to gather them back up. There's no hurry now. None at all. We have the whole long night ahead of us, and the story only gets deeper and warmer from here. In the next stretch, I'll tell you what it really means to be turned inward or outward. And I promise you, it has almost nothing to do with whether you're shy or quiet or good at parties. That's the mistake nearly everyone makes, and it's such an easy one to fix once someone finally explains it to you slowly, in the dark, with nothing else to do but listen. So, keep your eyes closed. Keep your breathing long and slow. Let the weight of the blanket hold you down toward the mattress, and let my voice go on ahead of you into the quiet, laying out the road. There is nothing you need to understand. There is nothing you need to remember. If you drift off before I finish, that's not a failure. That's the whole idea. The story will still be here, unfolding gently. Whether you follow every word or let most of them wash right over you like slow water. Just for a moment more, before we turn the next page, stay with the picture of that lonely, brilliant man, sitting up late over his enormous book, walking back through 3,000 years of human thought, and finding, again and again, the same two kinds of soul looking back at him from every century. The one who turns inward, the one who turns outward. He gave them the old words, dressed in new meaning. And then, being Jung, he could not stop there, because he'd noticed that turning inward or outward was only the first and simplest division. There were, he realized, deeper differences still. Not just which way your energy flows, but what your mind does with it once it gets there. The way you take in the world, the way you decide what it all means. But that, The four functions, the compass of the mind, the two great corrections that will change how you hear the words rational and feeling forever. That is where we go next. For now, just rest. Let the house go quiet. Let the story keep turning gently in the dark, like a page turned by someone who loves you, in no hurry at all to reach the end. So, here we are again. Still awake, or perhaps just barely, teetering on that pleasant edge where words stop being information and start being something more like weather, something you feel moving through you without quite knowing where it came from or where it's going. That edge is a good place to be. Grandpa has been there himself many a night, sitting in the old chair by the lamp, a book open on his knee, reading the same paragraph 3 times and finding, each time, that it meant something slightly different. Not because the words had changed, because he had. Let me carry you forward now, gently, from where we left off. We were sitting with the image of Jung himself, that solitary, formidably curious man, working through his great book, walking the long corridor of human history and discovering that the split between the one who turns inward and the one who turns outward was not new. It was old, ancient, almost as old as the habit of noticing things about other people at all. He wrapped those old tendencies in new words, or rather in old words freshly sharpened, and called them introversion and extraversion. And we lingered with that idea for a while, feeling the weight of it settle. But Jung himself knew, even as he finished that first great definition, that he had not yet said the most important thing. He had told us which direction a person's energy tends to flow, inward toward the self and its private world, or outward toward the objects and people of the shared world. That was the beginning. It was not the whole picture. Not by a long way. And if we stop there, if we take introversion and extraversion as the whole of what Jung was trying to say, we end up with something accurate but thin, like describing a forest by saying it has trees in it. So let us go a little deeper tonight. Slowly, no rush. The first thing to understand, and this one trips almost everyone who comes to this subject for the first time, because the pop culture version of Jung never quite says it plainly, is that introversion and extraversion in Jung's actual framework are not descriptions of behavior. They are descriptions of energy, of where the mind's weight comes to rest. Think of it this way. Imagine a lamp. When you plug a lamp in, electricity flows through the wire and lights the bulb. You can point the lamp at the wall, or you can point it at a book on the table. The lamp is the same lamp, the current is the same current. What changes is only the direction the light travels. Jung called that current the basic fuel of the psyche, the raw charge of mental and emotional life, libido. And immediately, I should say, not Freud's libido. This is a crucial distinction, and it was, among other things, one of the fault lines along which Jung and Freud eventually parted ways. Freud's libido was specifically and primarily sexual energy. Jung took that word and widened it until it meant something much larger, general psychic energy. The total moving force of the mind. Everything the mind does, dream, plan, remember, desire, fear, imagine, grieve, runs on this fuel. Libido in Jung's hands is not about sex, it is about aliveness itself, the raw power that makes thought possible at all. Now, whether that energy flows primarily inward toward the subject, toward one's own interior world of thought and memory and feeling and imagination, or whether it flows primarily outward toward the object, toward the people and things and events of the external world, that is what defines the attitude. Introversion is not shyness. It is not preferring to stay home on a Friday night, though an introverted person might well prefer that. It is not quietness or seriousness or difficulty with small talk, though those things may or may not come along. Introversion, in Jung's precise sense, is the habitual direction of the libido's flow, inward toward the subject. The introverted person's psychic energy tends to gather at the pole of the self, and the outer world is experienced, often somewhat automatically, through the lens of that inner world. Objects, other people, events, situations are filtered through interior categories before they land. The person receives the world but processes it, weighs it, recreates it inside before responding to it. Extraversion, equally precisely, is not loudness, not confidence, not the ability to walk into a room full of strangers and immediately feel at ease, though again, those things may or may not accompany it. Extraversion is the outward flow. The extroverted person's psychic energy moves naturally toward the object, toward people, toward situations, toward the stimulation of the world outside the skin. The outer world does not need to be filtered through a rich interior before it registers. It arrives, and the person moves toward it or responds to it with something closer to immediacy. And here is the correction that is so simple, once stated, and yet so rarely stated. A person can be the life of every party, can be gregarious and warm and endlessly sociable, and still be, in Jung's technical sense, introverted, because the criterion is not behavior. The criterion is where the energy lives, where it is anchored, where it goes to rest and replenish. That ebullient, cheerful, much-loved social person may find, if you watch carefully and ask the right questions, that they spend large portions of every social evening quietly re-experiencing what is happening through the lens of their own inner world. And that when they come home, they need time alone, not because socializing is painful, but because the inner world is where they truly live, and they have been away from it all evening. The direction of the flow. That is all it is. And that distinction between energy direction and surface behavior is the thing the pop psychology version leaves out almost every single time. Now rest there for a moment. Let that settle. No need to apply it to yourself yet. Just let it hang in the air of the room like wood smoke from a chimney, pleasant and slightly mysterious, and not requiring anything of you except your gentle presence. Because there is a second correction Jung would want us to make, even before we go on to the 4 functions, and it is perhaps the most quietly subversive thing he said about all of this. Jung was famous, or should be famous, for resisting his own categories almost as soon as he made them. He built this elegant, two-sided system, this fundamental split between the turned inward and the turned outward, and then he said something that most of the personality test industry has been carefully not repeating ever since. He said, and this is widely attributed to him, repeated in Jungian circles in various forms, that there is no such thing as a pure introvert or a pure extrovert. Such a person, he suggested, would belong in a lunatic asylum. Those exact words, or words very like them, appear in the tradition again and again. Now, the precise phrasing is one that Jungian scholars handle with care, noting that the wording has travelled and shifted a little in the retelling. But the idea behind it is entirely and genuinely Jungian. It runs through everything he wrote on this subject. A person who is wholly and unrelentingly directed inward, with absolutely no capacity to turn toward the world at all, is not a type. That is a pathology. A person who is wholly and ceaselessly directed outward, with no inner life to speak of, no capacity to turn toward the self, is equally unwell. The psyche, Jung believed, is a living system, and like all living systems, it requires balance in some form, even in the most lopsided of personalities. More than that, Jung said something even more interesting. He believed the majority of people do not cleanly belong to either attitude. He thought the genuinely, purely introverted or extroverted individual was not the norm, but the outlier. Most people, the great middle swathe of humanity, showed characteristics of both, in varying proportions, sometimes shifting depending on the circumstances. The balance might tilt one way under pressure and another way when at ease. The inner world might dominate in solitude and the outer world come alive in the company of someone you love. A word entered the popular vocabulary much later, ambivert, to describe this balanced person Jung was gesturing at. He would not have used that word himself, but the concept is his, and it predates the coinage by decades. Why does this matter? Because the entire edifice of the personality test industry rests, more or less, on the assumption that you are one or the other. That if you answer enough questions, tick enough boxes, follow the algorithm long enough, you will arrive at a label that tells you which side of the line you are on, introvert or extrovert, with a score and a percentage. Jung built the axis that makes that question possible, and then almost immediately said that for most people the question has no clean answer. The axis exists. It is real. It describes a genuine difference in the habitual direction of psychic energy, but it is not a wall with a door in it. It is a river with currents that shift. For most people, the dominant current is what matters, and the opposite current is always present underneath, ready to be called upon. Sometimes surging up unexpectedly, sometimes developed with years of effort and self-knowledge. Let the breath go slowly out. The house is quiet. Whatever sounds you hear out there in the world, a car passing on a street, the soft sound of the building settling, wind at the edge of a window, let them be part of the dark, not interruptions to it. You are perfectly safe. The story continues. So we have established, gently, without hurry, that introversion and extraversion are directions of psychic energy, not fixed behavioral categories. That most people live somewhere in the long middle. That a pure type is an extreme. And that the words themselves are older than Jung, though the meaning he poured into them was entirely his own. Now we come to the part that Jung himself felt was the real engine of the system. The part that, when he wrote it, he believed he was saying something genuinely new. Not just a restatement of what the ancient world already knew about the inward and the outward soul. That distinction was everywhere, as he'd shown across hundreds of pages of historical survey, but a new layer beneath it, a deeper structure that had been waiting, uncharted, to be named. He called them the four functions. And to understand them, I want you to picture a compass. An old one, the kind you find in a wooden box in the drawer of a very organized person who also owns a collection of maps they have never used but cannot bring themselves to throw away. 4 points, north, south, east, west, simple, stable, each point exactly opposite one other. That is the diagram Jung was drawing. 4 mental functions, arranged as 2 pairs, each pair sitting on its own axis, each function sitting at the opposite end of the axis from one other function. It is a compass of the mind. Now, what are these functions? In the most basic terms, they are the 4 different ways the mind can engage with experience. Every mind uses all 4 to some degree. The question, and this is where Jung's typology really begins, is which function you favor. Which one leads? Which one sits in the comfortable chair at the head of the table, doing most of the work, the one you trust and rely on almost automatically whenever life asks something of you? The four functions are these: thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition. Say them softly to yourself if you like. Thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition. They sound familiar. They sound like ordinary words for ordinary things everyone experiences. And that is partly what makes them both accessible and treacherous. Because Jung was using these words precisely, technically, in ways that do not quite match their everyday meanings. And the mismatch between his precise use and our casual use is the source of almost every major misunderstanding about this system. So let us take a breath and let Grandpa untangle it for you, one thread at a time. First, the arrangement. On one side of the compass, you have what Jung called the rational functions. On the other side, the irrational functions. And I must stop immediately, because those two words, rational and irrational, are almost certainly triggering the wrong picture in your mind right now. When you hear rational, you think logical, sensible, clear-headed. When you hear irrational, you think illogical, confused, driven by emotion. That is a completely natural response, because that is what those words mean in ordinary usage. And in Jung's system, that ordinary meaning is precisely and entirely wrong. Jung used rational and irrational in a technical, almost algebraic sense that has nothing to do with logic versus confusion. He meant something much simpler and more structural. Rational, for Jung, meant the function that evaluates, the function that judges, the function that takes in the raw material of experience and runs it through a standard, applies a criterion, weighs it against something, and arrives at an assessment. Rational functions do not just receive, they evaluate what they receive. Irrational, for Jung, meant the function that simply perceives. That takes in the raw material of experience without evaluating it, without running it through a standard, without saying good or bad, true or false, worth something or worth nothing, just receiving what is there, perceiving without judging. Two functions evaluate, two functions perceive. The two that evaluate are the rational ones, thinking and feeling. The two that perceive are the irrational ones, sensation and intuition. Now, a very reasonable question arises immediately. We said the rational functions evaluate. We said feeling is one of the rational functions, and many of you, perhaps most of you, are now quietly disagreeing with that. Feeling rational? Feeling is the opposite of rational. Feeling is what happens when reason goes out the window. Feeling is emotion. It's the hot surge, the tight throat, the impulse that overrules the plan. Of course, feeling isn't rational. But that, Jung would gently say, is exactly the misunderstanding he was most concerned about. And correcting it is perhaps the single most useful thing this whole long book of his actually does. Feeling, in Jung's system, is not emotion. Not the heat in the chest, not the tears that arrive without permission, not the wave of anger or grief or delight that moves through you before thought has had a chance to catch up. Those things, those physiological surges, those autonomic states, are what Jung called affect. They are not functions, they are not psychological types, they are weather patterns that pass through. Every type experiences them. Feeling, as a psychological function in Jung's framework, is something far more deliberate and far more architecturally important. Feeling is the capacity to assign value, to weigh something against a scale of worth. This matters or this doesn't matter. This is agreeable or this is disagreeable. This aligns with what I care about or this violates it. Feeling is the mind's value-sensing instrument. It evaluates. Yes, that is why it is rational. It runs experience through a criterion, and that criterion is a hierarchy of values. What is precious? What is beautiful? What is right, in the sense of morally right, or aesthetically right, or humanly right? What deserves attention, and what does not? A person with highly developed feeling as a function is not necessarily a person who cries easily or who wears their heart on their sleeve or who cannot maintain composure under pressure. They may be extremely controlled, even apparently cool. What they possess as a dominant function is a finely calibrated inner scale of worth. They know what matters. They know almost instantly, often without being able to fully explain why, whether something has value or lacks it, whether a situation calls for care or can be set aside, whether a relationship is genuine or hollow, whether a piece of work has something true in it or is merely technically accomplished. This is not emotion. This is evaluation, a kind of rigorous, if not strictly logical, discrimination. Compare it to thinking, which is the other rational function. Thinking also evaluates. Thinking also runs experience through a standard and arrives at a judgment. But its standard is different. Thinking asks, is this true or false? Is this logically consistent? Does this follow from what we know? What is the cause, and what is the effect, and does the chain hold up? Thinking is the function that connects ideas through formal or logical relationships. It says yes or no based on evidence and inference. Both thinking and feeling are rational, both evaluate, both judge. But they judge by different criteria. Thinking by truth value, feeling by worth value, and crucially, in Jung's system, neither is superior to the other. A person who judges primarily by logic is not wiser than a person who judges primarily by value. They are differently equipped. They will arrive at different answers to the same question, and in many cases both answers will be legitimate, because the question is this true, and the question does this matter, are both important questions, and they are not always the same question. Let the room be still. Let that thought rest there without your trying to do anything with it. You have probably spent a great deal of your life comparing those two modes, the one that says, but is it logical, and the one that says, but does it feel right, and quietly suspecting that one of them is more trustworthy than the other. Jung would say, both of them are real. Both of them are necessary. Both of them are doing something the other one cannot quite do. The argument between head and heart, as people call it, is not a battle between reason and unreason. It is a negotiation between two different rational instruments, measuring the same situation with different but equally valid gauges. Now for the other pair. The irrational functions. The ones that perceive without evaluating. Sensation and intuition. And again, the words are deceptive in their ordinariness. Sensation sounds like something simple. You touch a hot pan and you feel it. You see the colour of the autumn leaves. You hear the rain starting against the window. Sense data, the information that comes in through the five senses. And Jung's sensation is related to that, but it is a fuller concept. Sensation, as a psychological function, is the faculty of perceiving what concretely and actually is. Right here, right now. In this specific, material, present moment. It perceives the facts on the ground, the particulars, the details, the hard edges of what is actually in front of you rather than what might be there, or what was once there, or what you'd expect to be there based on a pattern you've noticed. A person with strong sensation lives very much in the real and the immediate. They notice things others miss, not in some mystical way, but in a practical and grounded way. The exact number on the gauge, the particular texture of the paper, the small change in someone's posture that nobody else caught. The question sensation is always implicitly asking is, what is actually here? What are the facts of this concrete situation right now? Intuition, its opposite on the other axis, asks a different question entirely. Where is this going? What does this mean beyond what is immediately apparent? Intuition, for Jung, is the function that perceives through the unconscious, not through the five senses, but through some subtler sensing of patterns, possibilities, and connections that have not yet fully manifested in the concrete world. The intuitive person catches things before they are visible. They have hunches they cannot fully explain. They perceive the whole shape of something before they have examined its parts. They see around corners. The question intuition is always implicitly asking is, what could this become? What is the underlying pattern? Where is this heading? Now, these two functions, sensation and intuition, sit at opposite ends of the second axis, just as thinking and feeling sit at opposite ends of the first. And here is a thing that tends to feel illuminating once you hear it, the dominant and the inferior function. The one you are best at and the one you are worst at always sit at exactly opposite ends of the same axis. If you live primarily through sensation, your inferior, least developed function is intuition. If your dominant function is intuition, sensation is the rough and undeveloped corner of your psyche. The same opposition applies to thinking and feeling. A strong thinker has a primitive feeling function. A strong feeler has a clumsy, undeveloped thinking function. This is not an accident of personality. In Jung's model, it is a structural necessity. You cannot develop both ends of the same axis simultaneously. Pushing energy down one pole means pulling it away from the other. The strength is inseparable from the corresponding blind spot. But we will come back to that in a little while. The inferior function deserves its own unhurried chapter. And it is perhaps the most remarkable thing in all of this, the part that the personality tests quietly set aside, and that holds what Jung actually thought the point of all this was. For now, let it be a seed in the soil. You know it is there. Let your eyelids be heavy, if they want to be. The body likes the dark, and the mind, after a while, grows fond of it too. You don't have to hold on to everything. The bones of it will be there in the morning, if you want them, the compass with its 4 points, the 2 axes, the pairs. Or they will have become something gentler and less precise in the night, which is equally fine. The precise version was always meant to be a tool, not a cage. There is something I want to dwell with you on before we move to the next turning of the story, because I find it one of the most quietly beautiful things about the way Jung thought about all this. He built this map, this careful, elaborate map with its 2 attitudes and its 4 functions. He spent years building it, and hundreds of pages defending it, and a significant portion of his intellectual life explaining it to colleagues who were skeptical and to patients who found it either liberating or annoying, sometimes both at once. He cared about this map enormously. And yet, he kept insisting that the map was not the territory, that the person in front of you was not a type, that the category was an approximation, a rough direction on a compass, a way of pointing, not a way of boxing. He thought in terms of dominant tendencies, habitual directions, characteristic patterns. He did not think in terms of permanent fixtures. The person who is predominantly an introverted thinker at 40 may have been much less clearly that at 20. The person who seems entirely extroverted in the company of strangers may be a deeply introverted creature in the solitude of their own creative work. The map helps you orient. It does not tell you where you are standing. It does not tell you where you will be. And the 4 functions, here is the really important piece. The 4 functions are not something you choose or display or perform. They are, Jung believed, something constitutional, something given, the way a dominant hand is given. Most people are right-handed. They did not decide to be. They did not practice right-handedness until they got good at it. Something in their constitution settled early on preferring that side. The dominant psychological function is similar. It tends to reveal itself early. It tends to feel natural rather than effortful, and it tends to be the one the person reaches for first in any situation that demands something from them. Consider a simple example. A problem arises, say, an argument with a friend that has left things feeling unresolved. How do you approach it? One person goes immediately to the facts. What exactly was said? In what order? What were the logical inconsistencies in the argument? What does the evidence actually show about who was right? That person is leading with thinking. Another person's first move is to ask, what does this mean for the relationship? What was the real hurt underneath the surface disagreement? What matters here, not in terms of who was technically right, but in terms of what this person means to me and what I want to preserve. That person is leading with feeling. A third person replays the scene in close-up detail. The expression on the friend's face at a particular moment, the exact words used, the specific context of the room they were in, attending to the concrete and the particular with great precision. That person is leading with sensation. A fourth person zooms out and starts seeing the pattern. This argument is the same argument in a different costume, they realize. It points towards something structural in the relationship, a long-running tension, and the resolution is going to require addressing that deeper thing, not the surface incident. That person is leading with intuition. Same problem. 4 very different first moves. None of them wrong. All of them real. And each person, if you pressed them, would probably find it difficult to explain why they went to their particular function first. It would feel like the obvious thing to do, the natural starting point, the thing that makes sense, because the dominant function always feels like common sense, which is exactly what makes it invisible until someone points at it. Now, Jung was also at pains to say, and this is an important nuance that tends to get lost, that no person lives through a single function alone. The dominant function is the leader, but it does not rule without support. There is what Jung called an auxiliary function, a second function that assists the dominant one, that fills in some of what the dominant leaves out. And crucially, the auxiliary function is always drawn from the other pair. So if your dominant function is a rational one, if you lead primarily through thinking or feeling, your auxiliary helper comes from the irrational pair, from sensation or intuition. And conversely, if your dominant is an irrational perceiving function, your auxiliary comes from the rational pair. The design is elegant. The second function compensates for the fundamental limitation of the first. A dominant thinker who has sensation as a secondary function is kept anchored to concrete facts. A dominant thinker with intuition as a secondary function tends to range across possibilities and large patterns. Neither is simply a cold logic machine, because the auxiliary keeps pulling in a different dimension of experience. This is one of the reasons Jung's system produces more than 4 types. When you factor in not just the dominant function, but the attitude, introversion or extraversion, in which it operates, you begin to multiply. An introverted thinker and an extroverted thinker are using the same leading function, but pointed in different directions, and the result in actual human personality is quite distinct. The introverted thinker tends to build elaborate inner conceptual systems that may remain largely private. Think of the theoretical physicist working on a model the rest of the world will not see for decades. The extroverted thinker tends to apply logical analysis to the outer world in a more immediately practical and communicable way. Think of the lawyer constructing an argument designed to work on 12 specific people sitting in a jury box. Both lead with thinking. Both are concerned with truth and logical consistency. But one is pointing inward and one is pointing outward, and the lived experience of being around them, or being them, is quite different. So the attitude and the dominant function together give you 8 primary types, and the auxiliary adds another layer of nuance beneath that. Jung enumerated those 8 types: introverted thinking, extroverted thinking, introverted feeling, extroverted feeling, introverted sensation, extroverted sensation, introverted intuition, extroverted intuition, and described each of them in the book, not as neat little boxes, but as tendencies, as characteristic shapes of personality that he had observed across many years of clinical practice, and that he believed, with considerable conviction, mapped onto something real in the deep structure of human psychology. He did not claim it was the only map. He would have been the first to say that a map with 8 regions is not the same as the infinite variety of actual human beings who live and die and dream inside those regions. But he believed the map pointed at something that was there, something structural, something that, if you learnt to read it, made the people around you a little less baffling and yourself a little less opaque to your own understanding. And opaque is a useful word because the part of the system that remains most opaque, to us, to the people around us, and in many ways to the personality tests that claim to measure all of this, is the part we have not reached yet tonight. The inferior function. The primitive one. The one that is almost entirely in the dark. The one that erupts when you are exhausted or overwhelmed or deeply afraid, and does so in a crude, ungovernable form that astonishes even the people who know you best. That is the part that holds the real secret. Not just about weakness, though weakness is certainly involved. About growth, about what Jung called individuation, the long, slow process of becoming a whole person rather than a highly developed half-person, and about why the person who once fascinated you absolutely, who seemed to have everything you lacked, who you were drawn to with a pull that felt almost gravitational, why that same person is now, some years later, the one whose particular habits of mind drive you quietly and thoroughly up the wall. But that is our next chapter, and we are not there yet. No hurry. The night is long, the room is warm, the blanket is exactly the right weight. For now, let the compass of the 4 functions rest in your mind like a simple picture. Just the 4 points. 2 that evaluate, thinking by truth, feeling by worth. 2 that perceive, sensation seeing what is, intuition sensing what could be. And the correction, the quiet important correction, settled in underneath, rational does not mean logical, irrational does not mean confused, and feeling. That most misunderstood of Jung's 4 words is not the hot rush of emotion. It is the mind's most careful measure of what matters. That is more than most people ever get from a lifetime of taking personality tests. It is the actual thing, the original thought, before it got trimmed and packaged and turned into a score on a website. And it is exactly the kind of knowledge that, unlike the score on the website, tends to stay with you. To change slightly how you hear the word feeling when someone uses it about themselves. To make you pause just for a moment before you assume that the person leading with logic is being cold, or that the person leading with values is being irrational. They are being differently rational. And that is a very different thing. Rest now. Let the image of the compass float softly, compass style, with the 4 points pointing gently in their 4 directions in the dark behind your eyes. You don't need to memorize which is north. You just need to know the shape of it. The rest will come. Outside, the world is doing whatever the world does in the small hours, the slow breathing of a city winding down, or the deep country silence that feels, if you let it, like the universe holding its breath. Either way, it is not your concern tonight. Your only concern is the weight of the pillow, the long, slow rise and fall of breathing, and perhaps, very gently, the distant voice of an old man following you down into sleep, carrying a very old story about the 4 corners of the mind. Now, that compass. Keep it there a little longer if you would, that soft 4-pointed shape floating behind your closed eyes. Because we have only looked closely at 2 of its 4 points so far. The 2 that judge, the 2 that evaluate and weigh and decide. Thinking and feeling, the rational pair, each one a different court with a different standard of evidence, each one perfectly reasonable on its own terms. They sit on one axis of the compass, pointing at each other across the center. The other axis is something else entirely. The other pair of functions does not judge at all. They do not evaluate, do not decide, do not weigh one thing against another. They simply, and this word is the key, they simply perceive. They take in what is there. They receive. And Jung called them, for that reason, irrational functions. Not irrational in the sense of confused or muddled. Irrational in the sense that they operate before any judgment has been applied. They arrive at the raw fact of experience before the mind has decided what to do with it. One of these perceiving functions looks at what is immediately, concretely, undeniably here, right now. The floor under your feet. The weight of the blanket, the exact temperature of the room, the specific sound coming through the window, whether it is traffic or wind or the distant low note of a train. This function lives entirely in the present tense, in the sensory fact, in the thing you can touch or see or measure or taste. Jung called it sensation. Sensation at its most natural asks a single question. Not a complicated question, not a philosophical one. The simplest, most grounded question there is. What is here? That is all. What is actually, physically, undeniably here right now? The sensation type, the person in whom this function leads, in whom it is most naturally awake and alive, tends to be extraordinarily good at the concrete world. They notice the chip in the paint on the wall. They remember the exact flavor of a meal they ate 15 years ago. They know how many steps it takes to walk from the kitchen to the back door. They trust what they can verify. They are drawn to craftsmanship, to process, to the satisfaction of a thing done exactly right. Give them a problem, and they want the facts first, all of them. in order, before they begin to speak. Ask them how they are feeling, and they might tell you about their shoulder. Because the shoulder is what is actually, right now, present and real. This is a gift. It is an extraordinary gift. The world runs in enormous measure on this function, on the patient, careful attention to what is actually, verifiably the case. The surgeon who notices the slight discoloration in tissue that no one else caught. The accountant who finds the error on page 47 because the number did not feel quite right against the memory of the number on page 12. The carpenter who can look at a doorframe and know, without measuring, that it is a quarter-inch off plumb. Sensation grounds the world. It keeps us from drifting away from the real into places where nothing can be built or fed or repaired. But the fourth point on the compass looks at none of that. The fourth function, the other member of the perceiving pair, does not ask what is here. It asks something quite different. It looks at the same room, the same facts, the same data the sensation type has carefully assembled, and then it does something that would drive a pure sensation type to quiet desperation. It ignores most of it. Not out of sloppiness, not out of carelessness. It ignores the surface of the present because it is already looking at something else. It is looking at what is not yet visible, at the possibility hiding inside the fact, at where this is going rather than where it is. Jung called this function intuition. Intuition, in the technical sense Jung gave it, is not a hunch. It is not mystical. It is not, as the word has come to mean in casual conversation, a vague feeling that something might be true. For Jung, intuition is a genuine perceptual function, just as sensation is. But it perceives via the unconscious rather than via the senses. It picks up on patterns the conscious mind has not assembled yet. It registers trajectories rather than positions. It arrives at the end of the story before the middle has been told, because it is reading something other than the explicit evidence. The question it asks is not what is here. Its question is, where is this going? The intuitive type, the person whose dominant function is intuition, can walk into a room and have a strong, immediate, often accurate sense of the atmosphere, the tension, the unspoken story, long before anyone has said a word that would explain it. They tend to be drawn to possibilities rather than actualities, to the nascent rather than the established, to what could be built from these materials rather than to what the materials themselves currently are. They tend to get bored quickly when a situation is fully known and charted. They thrive on the moment when something is still in flux, still becoming. They can be extraordinarily bad at the present tense, at remembering exactly where they left their keys or whether they have already eaten lunch, because their attention is reliably in another time, often the future, occasionally a deeply reconstructed past, rarely the precise, unmistakable, demanding now. This is also a gift, of a different kind. The person who can see, not what a company is, but what it could become. The therapist who knows, not from anything said, but from the quality of silence, that the patient is approaching something important. The teacher who senses, halfway through explaining a concept, that it has clicked for exactly one student in the room, and turns the explanation just slightly to let the others in. Intuition reads the invisible grammar of a situation. It finds the pattern in the noise, sets sensation against intuition on the compass, not opposed in value, but opposed in direction, and you begin to see how two people can look at the same situation and experience it so completely differently that they might almost seem to be in separate rooms. The sensation type is richly, vividly present. The intuitive type is richly, vividly elsewhere. One is reading the page that is open. The other is already wondering how the book ends. Neither is wrong. Both are perceiving something real. They are just perceiving different layers of the same reality, the surface and the depth, the fact and the implication, the what is here and the where is this going. And now the compass is complete. Two judging functions on one axis, thinking and feeling, each applying a different standard of worth and truth. Two perceiving functions on the other, sensation and intuition, each opening a different window onto experience. The 4 points. The one, shape. Now, here is where the model becomes something more than a description. Because Jung did not stop at the functions themselves, he did something more interesting. He took those 4 functions and set them against the 2 attitudes, introversion and extraversion, that he had already laid out, the 2 directions of psychic energy, inward and outward. And when you combine 4 functions with 2 attitudes, you get 8 distinct ways of being in the world. Not 4, 8. Each function can be lived in either direction. You can think primarily about the inner world, turning logic toward questions of personal meaning and inner coherence. Or you can think primarily about the outer world, turning logic toward external systems, facts that can be verified, structures that can be built. Those are different kinds of thinking, different in temperament and in emphasis, even though both are recognizably thinking in Jung's sense. You can feel, in the introverted sense, your value function turned inward, generating a deep, quiet, often intensely private system of personal values that may be invisible to the people around you, but that is completely consistent and often passionate underneath. Or you can feel, in the extroverted sense, genuinely, warmly, immediately responsive to the emotional atmosphere of the people in the room, tuned to what others are experiencing, the social fabric made visible. 2 very different presences, both feeling in Jung's original sense, both judging by value, but directed in completely different ways. And so for all 4 functions. Introverted sensation, which tends toward a rich, almost pictorial inner library of past sensory experience, a deep fidelity to how things were and should be. Extroverted sensation, which tends toward an immediate, vibrant engagement with the present physical world, sensation as appetite, as pleasure, in the sensory fact of now. Introverted intuition, which turns the perceiving of patterns inward, generating visions, metaphors, symbolic understanding that can feel almost prophetic. Extroverted intuition, which turns the same function outward, sniffing possibilities in the outer world, moving quickly between ideas and projects, drawn to the next interesting thing before the current interesting thing has been fully explored. 8 types in total. And this, Jung said, is a map, not a cage. 8 regions, not 8 boxes. The point was never to pin a person down and label them. The point was to understand what a person's natural direction of energy and natural preferred function tend to produce, what they make easy, what they make difficult, what they leave in shadow. Because the most important thing about having a dominant function is not what it gives you. It is what it takes away. Here is how it works. For most people, not everyone, but most, one of the 4 functions becomes the leading one, the most practiced, the most trusted, the one that gets called into service first when a situation is unclear or demanding. Jung called it the dominant or superior function, and it is supported, usually, by one of the functions from the other pair. A perceiving function assists if you are primarily a judging type, A judging function assists if you are primarily a perceiving type. This auxiliary function gives some balance, some range. A person who leads with thinking but has intuition as a strong second can bring systematic logic to bear on complex possibilities, on emerging patterns, on ideas that don't yet have form. A person who leads with feeling and has sensation as a second can bring a warm, value-grounded attention to the concrete facts of people's actual, present-tense situations. The auxiliary function is what stops the personality from being purely one note. It is the counter-melody that makes the dominant theme richer. Without any auxiliary, a dominant thinking type would be so purely logical as to be almost unable to navigate anything that involved a living person. The auxiliary gives the personality its texture, its range, its ability to move between different registers. But there is still the other axis, the opposite of the dominant function, across the center of the compass, is the one that receives almost none of the person's conscious attention, none of their practice, none of the investment that a lifetime of relying on a particular capacity tends to produce. It is the function that was never called on, never exercised, never brought into the light long enough to develop anything like the fluency and grace of the dominant. Jung called it the inferior function. And here is where the theory stops being a personality quiz and starts being something that cuts a little closer. The inferior function is not merely undeveloped. It is unconscious, in the technical Jungian sense, meaning it does not operate under the governance of the conscious ego. It is down there, somewhere beneath the surface, existing not as a polished instrument, but as a primitive, unformed, half-awake version of what it might have become if anyone had ever paid it proper attention. If your dominant function is thinking, then feeling sits at the opposite pole, and the version of feeling that lives in your unconscious is not the sophisticated, nuanced, precisely calibrated value judgment that a dominant feeling type has spent a lifetime developing. It is something much more archaic, much more raw, more like a child's feeling than an adult's, easily hurt, easily overwhelmed, easily reduced to its most extreme and clumsy expressions. The same is true across the compass. Dominant feeling means inferior thinking. Dominant sensation means inferior intuition. Dominant intuition means inferior sensation. Whatever is most practiced and polished in the light is mirrored by something most neglected in the dark. The compass is not just a map of your strengths, it is a map of your blind spot. And this matters in ordinary daily life. In most circumstances, when you are rested, when you are not particularly under pressure, when the situation is manageable, the inferior function stays largely quiet. The dominant handles what needs handling, the auxiliary assists, and the inferior sits somewhere below the threshold of awareness, present but dormant, like a note that is not being played. But when fatigue sets in, when the pressure becomes sustained, when you are sick or frightened or pushed past what you can comfortably process, when you have been running on your strongest gear for too long and the engine begins to overheat, then the inferior function wakes up. And it does not wake gently. What happens, in the language later Jungians gave to it, is that a person is said to go in the grip. The inferior function, unconscious and primitive, and without the tempering influence of decades of practice, erupts into the personality. It takes the wheel. And because it has none of the refinement of the dominant, what it produces looks nothing like the best version of that function. It looks like a bad imitation, a parody, the crude, childish, archaic form of a capacity that in another person in another type might be a mature and steady instrument. The coolly logical thinker, the person whose thinking has always been their anchor, their source of clarity and confidence, the thing people rely on them for, under enough pressure, through enough exhaustion, can find themselves dissolving into exactly what you would least expect. Not logic, not analysis, crude, overwhelming sentimentality. Tears that feel inappropriate and confusing. A sudden, catastrophizing conviction that nobody actually loves them. Hypersensitivity to small slights that they would normally not even notice. The inferior feeling has come up from below, and it has none of the calibration of a dominant feeling type's response. It is all or nothing. It is melodrama without self-awareness. It does not look like the thinking type you know. It looks nothing like them. And the deeply feeling person, the one whose dominant function is feeling, whose value judgments are usually so warm and so accurate, who navigates human relationships with a kind of quiet expertise, under the same conditions of sustained stress or exhaustion, can produce exactly the opposite catastrophe. A sudden, brittle attempt at cold logic that has none of the subtlety of a genuine thinking type's analysis. Rigid, clumsy, all-or-nothing arguments, often delivered with an aggressive certainty that rings false even to the person making them. A withdrawal into a kind of icy, pseudo-rational position that satisfies no one, and that, in retrospect, was clearly not what was meant at all. The inferior thinking has surfaced, carrying none of the mature thinking type's ability to separate the logical from the personal. It looks, from the outside, like a person suddenly becoming someone else, which is, in a way, exactly what is happening. Marie-Louise von Franz, who worked alongside Jung for years and became one of the most careful students of his typology, gave a series of lectures specifically on this, on the inferior function, on what it looks like when it erupts, on how different it is from the mature version of the same function, on the strange combination of primitiveness and intensity that marks it. She published those lectures, and they are still the most detailed account we have of what the grip actually feels like from the inside. She described the inferior function as being like a younger sibling of the dominant, there in the family, unavoidably present, but younger, less educated, less practiced, easily offended, easily overwhelmed. And she noted something that Jung himself had emphasized. The inferior function is not merely a problem to be managed. It is a door, but we will come to that door shortly. For now, hold the image, the compass. 4 points. One of them is lit, practiced, fluent, yours. One of them is your support, your second instrument. The one across from the dominant is in the dark. And in the dark, it is more itself than it ever could be in the light, more raw, more primitive, more ancient, less governed. Under pressure, it rises. And when it rises, it brings with it something that feels, to the person in the grip, like a loss of self. There is something I find important to say here, something that gets obscured in the popular versions of these ideas. Jung did not arrive at this map from nowhere. He was not working in an empty room with a blank sheet of paper, inventing categories from first principles. What he was doing in that long, strange book of 1921 was something more like archaeology than invention. He was looking back through centuries of human thought and finding the same shape, the same opposition, the same split between types, appearing again and again in the thinking of people who had never heard of Sigmund Freud and had certainly never heard of Myers-Briggs. He was making an argument. The argument was this: the tendency to divide humanity into two broad psychological orientations, inward and outward, interior and exterior, the world of the subject and the world of the object, is not a new idea. It is one of the oldest recurring patterns in human thought. It keeps surfacing across cultures and centuries because it is describing something real, something in the actual structure of the human mind that has been noticed, in one form or another, for as long as people have been paying careful attention to how other people differ from them. Take the poet Friedrich Schiller, writing in the late 1700s, long before psychology existed as a discipline at all. Schiller made a distinction between what he called Narv poetry and sentimental poetry. Narv poetry is the poetry of the person who is fully at home in nature, who perceives and expresses without the gap of self-consciousness, who is simply in the world rather than always standing slightly apart from it and observing. Sentimental poetry is the poetry of the person who is always aware of the distance between the ideal and the real, who longs for a wholeness that is not available, who writes from the position of the reflective mind that knows it is separate from what it observes. Schiller was not writing about personality types in any clinical sense. He was writing about poetry. But Jung read him and saw the same polarity he was finding in his consulting room. The naive sensibility corresponds, in some important ways, to the extraverted orientation, outward, immediate, at home in the object. The sentimental sensibility has the quality of the introverted orientation, turned inward, reflective, oriented toward the subject's inner world of ideals and meaning. A century earlier in spirit, but writing near the same time, Nietzsche gave us the Apollonian and the Dionysian, the two great creative energies of ancient Greek culture, as Nietzsche saw it. The Apollonian, cool, ordered, luminous, the love of form and measure and clarity, the sunlit principle of the individual self held in beautiful definition. The Dionysian, wild, collective, ecstatic, the loss of self into something larger, the dark creative energy that dissolves boundaries rather than drawing them. Jung found in this opposition a reflection of the same deep split he was mapping. Not a perfect translation, not a one-to-one correspondence, but the same structural intuition that human beings tend, in some fundamental way, to lean one of two directions, and that this leaning shapes everything they make and do and love. William James, the American philosopher and one of the founders of psychology in the English-speaking world, had made a similar observation about philosophers themselves. He wrote about two kinds of philosophical temperament, the tender-minded and the tough-minded. The tender-minded philosopher tends toward rationalism, toward idealism, toward a view of the world as fundamentally hospitable to meaning. The tough-minded philosopher tends toward empiricism, toward materialism, toward insisting on what can be measured and proved. James was being somewhat playful with this distinction, and he knew it was a simplification. But he was pointing at something that kept recurring in the history of thought, the same two temperaments, the same two orientations, appearing in the way people approach the largest questions they can ask. There was Wilhelm Ostwald, the German chemist and Nobel laureate, who observed among scientists a split between what he called the classical type and the romantic type. The classical scientist worked slowly, carefully, with great precision, completing each investigation fully before moving to the next, favoring method and rigor and the accumulation of verified fact. The romantic scientist worked quickly, with bursts of inspiration, moving from idea to idea, sometimes leaving work unfinished when the next exciting possibility appeared, generating hypotheses faster than any one of them could be fully tested. Ostwald was writing about his colleagues, but the shape he was drawing is the same one Jung was drawing, from a completely different direction. A physician named Fernand Jordan had noted in the 19th century what he described as the difference between broad and narrow types. One kind of person naturally expanding their attention across a wide field of associations, another kind naturally concentrating with great precision on a narrow, focused beam. Again, a different vocabulary, a different domain, the same recurring shape. And Jung, because he was the kind of thinker he was, did not stop at the modern or the recent. He went back much further. He found the same opposition embedded in the very early history of Christian thought, in the conflict between two of the early theologians, Tertullian and Origen. Tertullian was the rigorous, legalistic, morally exacting voice for whom faith was discipline, obedience, the binding of the self to a firm external structure of doctrine. Origen was the speculative, the philosophical, the one who wanted to find the mystical and metaphysical depth beneath the literal text, who was drawn toward the inner meaning, the allegorical, the contemplative. They were not merely disagreeing about theology, Jung suggested. They were expressing in theological language the same opposition between two fundamental orientations of the psyche. One turned toward the external authority and structure of the object, the other turned inward toward the searching, speculative inner life of the subject. And the great medieval argument, the argument that absorbed some of the finest minds of several centuries, the dispute between the nominalists and the realists is, read through Jung's lens, another version of the same shape. The realists held that universal concepts, goodness, humanity, truth, are real things, existing independently of the particular individual objects that exemplify them. The nominalists held that only individual, concrete, particular things are real, and that the universal categories are simply names we apply, useful fictions the mind creates to organize its experience. The realists tend, in Jung's reading, toward the introverted orientation. The universal, the inner, the idea as primary. The nominalists tend toward the extraverted, the particular, the external, the concrete object as the starting point of all genuine knowledge, 800 years of academic disputation. And underneath it, the same compass. The same two directions that Jung's patients were displaying in his consulting room on a Tuesday morning in 1912. He was not inventing a new idea. He was, with the rigor of a trained clinician and the wide reading of a man who seemed to have absorbed half the library, showing that the same idea had been discovered repeatedly by people across centuries and disciplines, and that it kept coming back because the human mind keeps generating it, because the opposition it describes is genuinely there. This was part of what made Jung's book so long. He spent hundreds of pages on exactly this survey, on demonstrating the lineage before he arrived at his own system. Which is, among other things, why most people who encounter his typology through a quiz have no idea any of this is there. They have been handed the last chapter of a very long story and told it is the whole book. And then, when Jung had laid all of this out, the history, the lineage, the confirmation from a dozen different fields that the same basic polarity keeps appearing, he looked at himself. This is one of those small human moments that tends to get lost in the more formal presentations of the theory. Jung was not only a theorist, he was, always, also a subject. He was a person who had spent years observing himself with the same clinical attention he brought to his patients. And he was honest within the limits that any person can be honest about themselves, about where he found himself on his own map. He typed himself as an introverted thinking type. Dominant thinking, introversion, as the attitude, meaning that his logical, systematic, truth-seeking function was turned primarily inward, toward ideas, toward inner consistency and theoretical structure, toward the question of whether this makes sense on its own terms, rather than whether it is immediately applicable and useful in the outer world. This is consistent with the man who wrote a 600-page book, much of it dense intellectual history, before getting to his own clinical system. The thinking is evident everywhere in the work, the careful distinction-making, the taxonomic impulse, the need to define every term before using it. The introversion is evident in the sheer depth of the internal world the book inhabits. And alongside his dominant thinking, Jung acknowledged a strong intuition as his auxiliary, the secondary function that gave his thinking its particular character. The introverted intuition that reads not the surface of a thing but its hidden structure, its symbolic resonance, its direction of travel. This is the Jung who was drawn to mythology and alchemy and dreams and the deep patterns beneath the surface of what people said and did. The thinking gave it rigor and system. The intuition gave it depth and reach. He was reporting on himself, of course, and we should hold that lightly. Self-knowledge has limits that are especially interesting in a man who spent his career mapping those very limits. But the picture is consistent with the man as others knew him. The depth, the abstraction, the slight remove from the immediate social surface of things. The astonishing range of theoretical connection-making, the difficulty he sometimes acknowledged in the domain of warmth and immediate human responsiveness, which would have been, by his own typology, the inferior function he carried. His inferior function would have been feeling. Extroverted feeling, in some accounts, the warm, immediate, socially attuned responsiveness to the emotional atmosphere of the room. The version of that function that Jung carried was, by his own account and by the accounts of those who knew him well, sometimes clumsy, sometimes overwhelming when it surfaced, sometimes surprisingly intense in ways that caught him off guard. The great theorist of the inferior function, encountering his own inferior function, apparently with some of the same confusion and rawness he described in everyone else. Which is, if nothing else, a reminder that the map applies to the mapmaker too. The description of the inferior function he gives us is not abstract or clinical in its emotional register. It carries the weight of something personally known. When he writes about the way the inferior function erupts under pressure, when he describes the primitive and archaic quality it has, when he notes that it brings with it an emotional intensity disproportionate to the situation, he is writing, in part, from inside experience, not only from his chair across from the patient. There is something in this that matters beyond the biographical detail. It tells us that Jung's system was never meant to be held at a distance, never meant to be a classification scheme one applies to other people from the safe remove of a test or a questionnaire. It was meant to be something you live with, something you encounter in yourself with the discomfort and the humility that involves. The inferior function is not the least interesting part of you. Jung's claim, and it is a significant one that the later personality tests almost entirely discarded, is that it is the most important part. Not the most polished, not the most reliable, not the most pleasant to visit, but the most important, because it is the part that has not been integrated. It is the part that still has, in all its primitiveness and archaic rawness, the energy of the unfinished. The dominant function is, in some sense, already yours. You know it. You have spent a lifetime practicing it. It will do what you ask. The inferior function is the stranger at the edge of yourself, the one whose face you do not quite know. the one who only appears under conditions you did not choose. And everything Jung understood about psychological growth, the idea he called individuation, which we will come to, suggests that the direction of growth, the direction of becoming more fully oneself, is not toward a further perfection of the dominant, it is toward a turning, a slow and often uncomfortable turning, in the direction of the inferior. But that is a thought for the next part of the story. For now, rest with the map as it is, the compass with its 4 points. The 8 ways of being in the world, each one a combination of an attitude and a function. Each one a genuine way of experiencing and engaging with life. The dominant that is most fluent. The inferior that waits in the dark. And the long, patient history of a single idea that has been surfacing in human thought since before psychology had a name. The idea that people lean in different directions. That this leaning is deep and persistent and shapes everything they touch. And that the difference, as Jung saw it, is not a defect in the people who differ from you, but a different relationship to the same fundamental territory. The city has quieted a little more. Or the country has deepened its silence. You are somewhere between waking and not waking now, which is exactly the right place to be. The story does not require you to hold on. It will carry you wherever it needs to go. You only need to float, gently, in the slow current of it. The 4 functions. The 2 attitudes. The 8 types. The inferior function somewhere in the dark, patient and primitive, and full of something that has not yet been named. And outside or beyond or behind all of it, the long lineage of thinkers who kept noticing the same shape and kept trying to find the right language for it, from the medieval scholars arguing about the nature of universals to the old doctor in Zurich turning his clinical attention on himself and finding, as everyone does, something he had not quite expected. It is a very old idea. As old as the question of why the person next to you seems to live in a different world. As old as the question of why the things that come naturally to you are the very things that are hardest for the person you are closest to. As old as the question of whether that distance can be crossed, and whether, if it could be crossed, it would still be you on the other side. That question is where we are going next, and here is where the story turns inward one final time. Because everything we have covered so far, the 2 attitudes, the 4 functions, the 8 types, the inferior function stirring in the dark like something half-dreamed, all of it was, in Jung's own mind, preliminary, a map. And a map is not the journey. A map is only useful if you actually go somewhere with it. The question Jung kept returning to, the question that drove the whole enormous project of psychological types and the decades of clinical work that preceded it, was not what type are you. It was something closer to this. What do you do with what you discover? Jung had a word for the answer. He called it individuation. It is one of those words that sounds more complicated than it is. Individuation simply means the process of becoming more fully yourself, not a better version of some abstract ideal, not the person the world wants you to be, but the specific, complete, particular person that was always latent in you, waiting, and what stood between a person and that completeness, Jung believed, was not their weaknesses in the ordinary sense. It was not failure or laziness or bad luck. What stood between a person and wholeness was the thing they were best at. That is worth saying again slowly, because it is one of those ideas that sounds backwards until you sit with it for a moment. The obstacle to becoming whole is not what you do poorly. It is what you do well. Or more precisely, it is the fact that what you do well has been done so exclusively, so habitually, so automatically, that the opposite has been left in darkness. Think of the four functions again. Thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition. Each person has one that leads, one that supports, and then two that recede. The one that recedes the farthest is the inferior function, the one sitting at the opposite end of the compass from the dominant. And the inferior function is not simply undeveloped, it is something stranger than that. It is unconscious. It operates according to its own rules, which are not the rules of the dominant function at all. It is primitive, touchy, archaic when it erupts, and under enough stress or fatigue, it always does. It does not erupt with sophistication. It erupts with all the clumsiness of something that has never been trained, never been practiced, never been trusted. Marie-Louise von Franz, who worked alongside Jung for decades and who devoted an entire set of lectures to this single subject, said that the inferior function is where a person is most childish, most vulnerable, most easily wounded, and most easily provoked. The man who spends his whole professional life in precise logical analysis, the one whose thinking function is so developed that colleagues trust his conclusions absolutely, when his inferior feeling function finally breaks through, it does not emerge as warmth or nuance or empathy. It emerges as raw, bruised sentiment, as sudden tears he cannot explain, as a rage that seems disproportionate to anyone watching, but that feels, to him, completely and overwhelmingly justified. He has been pricked in a place that has no calluses because it has never been used. And the opposite is equally true. The person whose feeling function leads everything, the one who navigates the world through a constant, refined sense of what is valuable, what is harmonious, what matters. When their inferior thinking function surfaces under pressure, it does not produce clear argument or careful analysis. It produces something cold and clumsy and weirdly rigid, a pseudo-logic that is somehow both mechanical and confused, like watching someone try to perform surgery with a hand they have never used. The arguments are forced, the conclusions are brittle, and the person making them often cannot see what everyone around them sees clearly, that the thinking is not working, that it is a pale, graceless imitation of the real function they have spent their life ignoring. Von Franz called this being in the grip of the inferior function. It is an apt phrase, because when it happens, it is not chosen. It is not a decision to feel differently or think differently. The inferior function grips from below, from the unconscious, and in that grip, a person is not their best self. They are, in a very precise sense, not themselves at all. They are a less developed self, a younger self in some ways, a self that never had the chance to grow up. Now you might think the logical response to all of this is to simply work harder on the inferior function. Practice it, strengthen it, turn it into a second dominant function. But Jung said this is exactly the wrong move. And it is wrong not because effort is bad, but because the inferior function is not simply a skill gap. It is a doorway. This is the real payload. The part, as Jung saw it, that matters most. And it is the part that the personality tests would later quietly delete, because it does not lend itself to a questionnaire. The inferior function, precisely because it is unconscious. Precisely because it is the part of you that has been least touched by the organizing hand of the ego, is the place where the unconscious is most alive in you. It is messy and primitive and emotionally charged, yes, but those same qualities mean it is connected to something the dominant function, for all its competence, cannot reach. When you turn toward your inferior function, not to master it, not to make it as polished as your dominant, but simply to acknowledge it, to sit with it, to allow it some room, you are turning toward the part of yourself that has been waiting the longest. You are, in a sense, meeting a part of yourself you have never properly met. That meeting is what Jung meant by individuation. Not perfection, not the elimination of weakness. The integration of the whole compass, all 4 points. Not equally strong, not equally developed, that is not the goal, and was never the goal. But known. Acknowledged, not at war with each other anymore. And it is here that we arrive at one of the most beautiful and quietly painful things in all of Jung's typology. The thing that explains something most people have experienced, but few have had a name for. The person who drives you crazy. The one who also, for at least some part of your history together, was the person who made life feel more vivid. Jung observed something in his clinical work that he thought was worth noting carefully, and that later analysts in his tradition returned to again and again. People are often powerfully attracted to people whose dominant function is the function they have least developed in themselves. Not always, but often enough to be more than coincidence. The thinking type finds themselves drawn to someone who navigates the world through feeling, through warmth and value, and relational sensitivity. The sensation type, the one who is happiest with concrete facts and present details and things they can touch, is pulled toward the intuitive type. The one who lives perpetually in possibilities, in patterns, in what might be and what could come. And for a time, that pull is genuinely experienced as something wonderful, because the other person is doing something you cannot do, something that looks almost magical from where you stand. She brings me out of myself, a man might say. She makes me feel the things I usually push past. He grounds me, a woman might say. He reminds me that things are actually happening, right now, in the room, not only in my head. What they are each feeling, without having the language for it, is the fascination of the unlived function. The other person is living out, freely and naturally and without apparent effort, the very part of yourself you have neglected. That is admiration. That is attraction. It is real, and it is not simply projection in a dismissive sense. It is projection in the precise technical sense Jung used, which means that an unconscious content is seen in the outside world rather than recognized as one's own. The function you have not claimed in yourself is seen, experienced, admired in the person who naturally inhabits it. And for a while, that is a gift. The relationship does something for you that you could not do for yourself. But then time passes, and the inferior function does not become more comfortable simply because you are near someone who has the dominant version of it. The thinking type who was drawn to the feeling type eventually finds that the feeling type's way of navigating decisions, by value, by relational weight, by what feels right, becomes bewildering, then frustrating, then maddening. Not because the feeling type has changed, but because the thinking type is encountering, day after day, in the most intimate possible setting, the very function they cannot do. And what began as admiration curdles very slowly into something closer to resentment. Why can't she just think this through clearly? Why does everything have to be about how it feels? And from the other side, why can't he ever just feel something real? Why is everything always an argument to be won? What they are fighting about, underneath the specific words, is the inferior function, their own, projected, first with love, then with frustration, onto each other. The same difference that made the relationship electric is the same difference that makes it exhausting. Attraction and friction share one root. The unlived function projected onto another person is first a gift and then a demand. Jung's suggestion was not that this dynamic makes relationships impossible or that people should only pair with their own type. That would be its own impoverishment, a world in which you never encountered your inferior function in someone else's effortless hands. The suggestion was more subtle than that. It was that becoming aware of the mechanism, seeing that what infuriates you in your partner may be a reflection of what you have not yet claimed in yourself, changes the quality of the encounter. Not instantly, not without difficulty, but the awareness shifts something. The resentment becomes, at least sometimes, a question: what is it in me that cannot yet do this? And that question is one of the doors Jung was pointing toward. The one that leads, if you can hold it long enough, toward something that looks a little like wholeness. And then the tests arrived. And they flattened most of this into something much easier to sell. In the 1920s, a woman named Catherine Cook Briggs was reading widely in psychology, as many educated people did in that era when the field was new and its questions felt urgent and alive. When the English translation of Jung's Psychological Types appeared in 1923, translated by H.G. Baynes, the book that Grandpa was telling you about all evening, Catherine Briggs read it with the focus of someone who had been working toward the same questions and had just found, in Jung's framework, a language equal to what she had been reaching for. She had a daughter, Isabel Briggs Myers, and Isabel, over the years that followed, absorbed the framework and began to think about how it might be made useful in a practical sense, in the world of ordinary decisions and jobs and daily life. Isabel Briggs Myers was not a psychologist by training. Her degree was in political science. This is not mentioned here as a criticism. It is mentioned because it is part of the honest history of how one of the most widely used personality instruments in the world came into existence. A profound clinical theory developed by a Swiss psychiatrist over decades of observation was translated into a practical questionnaire by a mother and daughter who were gifted laypeople genuinely trying to do something useful with an idea they believed in. The timing of the instrument matters. Isabel Briggs Myers built the first version of what would become the Myers-Briggs type indicator during the early years of the Second World War. The motivation was practical in the most direct sense. The war was pulling enormous numbers of people into unfamiliar roles, and the question of which person was suited for which kind of work had an urgency it does not have in peacetime. If a questionnaire based on Jung's types could help match people to jobs they were temperamentally equipped for, it might serve a real human need in a moment of real human crisis. That is not a cynical origin. It is a generous one. The instrument grew from there. It was refined over years and decades, and it spread into corporations and counseling rooms and college orientation programs and HR departments across the world with a speed and reach that Jung, writing his dense 600-page book in 1921, could not possibly have imagined. But something happened in the process of translation. Several things happened, actually, some of them small, some of them not small at all. The most structurally significant change was this: Myers added a fourth dimension that Jung had never stated explicitly. She recognized that among Jung's 8 types, the 8 combinations of 4 functions and 2 attitudes, there was something further that mattered, which function a person showed primarily to the outside world. Was it their judging function, thinking or feeling, that they primarily extroverted? Or was it their perceiving function, sensation or intuition? This gave rise to a new axis, judging and perceiving, the J and the P in every four-letter empathy result. That was Myers's contribution, not Jung's. And when you multiply Jung's 8 types by this new distinction, you get 16. The famous 16 personalities. The 16 types you find on the personality test websites, each with a name and a set of adjectives and a list of famous historical figures. Those 16 are a Myers extension of Jung, built on genuine insight, but going beyond what Jung himself laid out. His count was 8. The extra 8 are hers. This matters not as a complaint, but as a fact of lineage. If you have ever taken the Myers-Briggs and received your 4 letters and felt, as many people do, a small flush of recognition, that feeling is real. The instrument is pointing at something. What it is pointing at has a genuine ancestor in the book Jung published in 1921. But the pointing instrument itself, the questionnaire, the 4 letters, the 16 boxes, that is not Jung's own architecture, it is a creative inheritance. And the scientific reception of that inheritance has been, to put it gently, mixed. Academic psychology has examined the Myers-Briggs type indicator carefully, the way it examines all instruments that claim to measure something about the mind. And the findings have been consistent enough over enough studies to be worth stating plainly. The instrument has poor test-retest reliability. That means a significant portion of people who take it, and then take it again, some weeks or months later, receive a different result the second time. Not a slightly different result, a different type, a different 4-letter combination. Which is a problem if the claim being made is that the instrument is measuring something stable about who a person is. Stable things, measured accurately, should give you the same reading on a Tuesday in March as they gave you on a Thursday in October. The instrument also works in forced binary categories, introvert or extrovert, thinking or feeling, where the underlying traits, when you actually measure them in the population, are not binary at all. They are continuous. They form smooth curves, with most people clustered near the middle and fewer people at the extremes. Forcing a continuous spectrum into a binary choice loses information, and it produces the strange situation where someone who scores very close to the midpoint on the introvert-extrovert scale is placed firmly in one category, while someone who scored at the same actual point in a different testing session might be placed in the other. The category is not wrong, exactly. It is just less precise than the underlying reality. And the instrument's ability to predict how people will actually behave in the world, in their careers, in their relationships, in their response to stress, is, by the standard measures of predictive validity, modest at best. The test is popular. It is widely used. It generates genuine feelings of recognition in many of the people who take it, but feelings of recognition, while real and not nothing, are not the same as scientific prediction. The Myers-Briggs does something useful for many people. What it does not do reliably is what a scientific personality instrument needs to do: give the same answer twice, and tell you something true about what a person will do next. None of which means the underlying ideas are worthless. It means the instrument designed to operationalize those ideas has limitations that the science has documented honestly. The actual scientific heir to Jung's introvert-extrovert distinction is quieter than the Myers-Briggs and considerably less famous, which is perhaps why it shows up on fewer office posters and birthday cards. It is called the Big Five, sometimes the 5-factor model, sometimes ocean from the first letters of its 5 dimensions: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, It is the model that academic personality psychology actually uses and trusts, the one that has replicated across cultures, that predicts behavior in studies, that shows up reliably when researchers measure the same person twice. And one of its 5 dimensions is extraversion. Spelled with an A or an O depending on the context, but pointing at the same broad territory Jung was surveying 100 years ago, the dimension that separates people who are energized by the outer world from those who are energized by turning inward. The dimension that had precursors stretching back through William James and Friedrich Schiller and the medieval theologians arguing in their cold stone rooms. It made it. From Jung's 1921 book, refined through clinical observation and theoretical argument, the idea of extraversion travelled far enough to land in the most empirically respected model of personality the field has produced. That is not a small legacy for a 600-page book that almost nobody reads. And then there is Hans Eysenck, a name that appears less often in popular discussions of personality, but one that carried Jung's central intuition, the introvert-extrovert difference, into the laboratory and tried to do something that Jung himself had not attempted. He tried to find the biology. Eysenck was a British psychologist working in the mid-20th century, and his approach was experimental, rigorously empirical, skeptical of the comfortable and the easy. He took the introversion-extraversion dimension and proposed that underneath the observable behavior, the social habits, the preference for quiet or noise, the way a person responds to stimulation, there was a physiological difference, a difference in the nervous system itself. His theory, which is called the cortical arousal theory, goes like this. Imagine that the brain maintains a certain level of background activity, a resting hum, neither too loud nor too quiet. Eysenck proposed that introverts, on average, have a higher baseline level of this cortical arousal. The brain is already running somewhat closer to its optimal level of stimulation even before anything external happens. And if you are already somewhat activated, already somewhat running near the comfortable range, you do not need, and in fact do not want, a great deal of additional stimulation from the world. Too much incoming stimulation pushes you over the comfortable threshold. You find the party draining, not because you dislike people, but because the noise and the input and the social demands are adding to an arousal level that was already sufficient. Extroverts, by this account, have a lower baseline level of cortical arousal. The brain, at rest, is running somewhat below its optimal range, which means the extrovert actively seeks stimulation, seeks the party, the noise, the company, the risk, because the brain is genuinely looking for more input. The external world is not too much. The external world is what brings the arousal level up to where it needs to be to function at its best. The extrovert is not reckless or shallow or incapable of solitude. The extrovert's brain is simply starting from a quieter resting point and reaching toward the world to find its balance. It is counterintuitive the first time you hear it. We tend to think of introverts as somehow quieter or smaller in their nervous systems, more fragile. And Eysenck is saying the opposite. The introvert's nervous system is, in some respects, more responsive, more reactive to incoming stimulation, running warmer at rest. And this is where the lemon drop enters the story. You may remember from earlier in this long night that Grandpa planted a small mystery. The promise of a single drop of lemon juice and a personality difference you could measure in saliva. Here is the answer to that. Eysenck and researchers working in his tradition devised an experiment that is elegantly simple. You place a small amount of lemon juice on a person's tongue, a single drop, or something very close to it, and you measure how much saliva that produces. The mouth's salivary response to the sour taste is a reflex triggered by the nervous system. It is not under voluntary control. You do not decide to salivate more or less. The nervous system simply responds at whatever level it responds. What the research found, and what has been replicated enough to be taken seriously, even if the effect sizes are modest, and it should not be thought of as a diagnostic test, is that introverts tend to produce more saliva in response to the lemon juice than extroverts do. The more reactive nervous system responds more strongly to the incoming sensory signal. The arousal that Eysenck predicted at a cortical level is mirrored in this small, observable, bodily response. Personality, written in the mouth's reflex, it is not a large effect, and you would not want to type anyone by their saliva alone. And the science is more complex and more contested than any single tidy experiment can capture. But as a demonstration of the basic idea that the introvert-extrovert difference might be something physiological, something present in the body and not only in the biography, something measurable in a way that has nothing to do with a questionnaire. It is one of the most vivid things in all the literature. The lemon drop test, a personality you can taste. And so here we are, very late now, or very early. The thin hours, the house utterly still around you, or the night sounds from outside doing their slow, soft work. This is the part where Grandpa pulls the threads back together, because a good story earns its ending. It does not just stop. We began, all those hours ago it feels like now, with a word spelled in a way most people have never seen it. Extrovert, with an A. A word that existed before Jung, rooted in Latin, older than psychology, older than the printing press. Intro, inward, extra, outside, vertere, to turn, words that were already in English as far back as the 1600s in theological writing and optical science, long before anyone applied them to the mind. What Jung did was not coin the syllables. What Jung did was give them the meaning they now carry everywhere in the world. He coined the concept. And there is a difference between those two things, and the difference is worth knowing. We traced that concept back to its real origin, the wound between two brilliant men. Freud, who looked at the same human suffering and saw the pull of the world, the outward movement toward objects of desire, the libido flowing away from the self. Adler, who looked at the same human suffering and saw the push of the self, the inward movement toward compensation, toward power, toward the assertion of the subject against an overwhelming world. And Jung, sitting between them, watching two minds he respected disagree completely about the same thing, who finally understood that they were not looking at different data. They were different types. The theory of psychological types was born to answer that question. Why do two equally rigorous minds reach opposite conclusions? And the answer was, because they are anchored in opposite attitudes toward the same reality. We moved through the two attitudes, not shyness, not loudness, but the direction of psychic energy. And through the four functions arranged on their cross, thinking and feeling judging from one axis, sensation and intuition perceiving from the other, we met the correction that almost nobody knows, that rational and irrational in Jung's system have nothing to do with logic and its absence, and that feeling is not emotion but a function of judgment, as rigorous in its way as thinking, measuring worth where thinking measures truth. We met the 8 types, the dominant and the auxiliary, the way the psyche keeps itself from becoming one-dimensional by always supporting the leading function with help from the other pair. And we came to the inferior function, the part sitting at the opposite pole from everything you are best at, unconscious, primitive, emotionally charged, erupting under stress, with all the clumsiness of something that has never learned to walk upright. The thinker collapsing into sentimentality, the feeler constructing brittle, forced arguments in a cold voice that is not quite their own. The thing that is both your greatest weakness and, if Jung was right, the only door to becoming whole. The real message was never the label, it was the integration. Individuation, the long, slow, patient work of turning toward what you have neglected. Not to master it, but to acknowledge it, to let it take up its proper place in the compass of yourself. Jung spent his life trying to say that the goal of psychological understanding is not to sort people into boxes and hand them a name. The goal is to become more fully the person you already are, by including the parts of yourself that the dominant function, in its efficiency and its confidence, has quietly been pushing away. And we came, finally, to the people who loved the idea enough to try to make it portable. Catherine Cook Briggs, reading Jung's book in the 1920s with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting her whole life for exactly this language. Her daughter Isabel, building the first version of the instrument in the war years, trying to help people find the right work in a moment when wrong work cost more than it usually does. Neither of them trained psychologists, both of them believing in the idea with a sincerity that matters, even if the science that followed told a complicated story about what the instrument could and could not reliably do. The 16 types that live on websites and workplace trainings and birthday cards, those are theirs as much as Jung's. The J and the P, the judging and the perceiving axis that turned 8 types into 16, that is Myers' addition to a framework Jung himself stopped at 8. A creative inheritance. A generous misunderstanding in some ways. A simplification that carried the idea to 100 million people, and also, in carrying it, changed it enough that the original is almost unrecognizable in the popular form. And the science moved on without the Myers-Briggs toward the Big Five, toward the ocean model and its careful empirical foundations, toward the single dimension of extraversion that survived the translation from clinical observation to statistical reality. The one Jungian term that crossed the border into mainstream science essentially intact, and toward Eysenck and his biological hypothesis and the lemon drop on the tongue that makes the introvert's body respond more strongly. The nervous system already running warm, already close to its comfortable threshold, already more in the world than it sometimes appears. One idea. 100 years. Millions of people who have taken a test and felt, for a moment, recognized. The feeling is not wrong. It is pointing at something real. What it is pointing at is older and stranger and more demanding than the test suggests, an idea born from a professional rupture, refined through clinical decades, grounded in a vision of the psyche, not as a collection of traits to be labelled, but as a living economy of energy, always moving, always seeking balance, always in conversation between the part that faces outward and the part that turns within. Jung himself, in the tradition that has grown up around his work, is described as an introverted thinking type with strong intuition. The man who mapped the interior of the mind by going, first and always, inward, who found the theory of types not by sitting above the psychology of his patients, but by asking what kind of mind looks at the world and sees Freud's answer, and what kind of mind looks at the same world and sees Adler's, and then asking, quietly, what kind of mind was asking. The question keeps asking itself. It was asking in the cold rooms of medieval scholars, arguing about whether the universal, the category, the type, is real or only a word. It was asking in Friedrich Schiller's famous essay on Narve and sentimental poetry. One poet who looks at nature and sees what is there, another who looks at the same nature and sees what has been lost. It was asking in Nietzsche's Apollonian and Dionysian, the dream and the ecstasy, the form maker and the form breaker. It was asking in William James, walking into his philosophy lectures with his list of tender-minded thinkers on one side and tough-minded ones on the other, every philosopher he had ever read, sorted into one column or the other, with the absolute confidence of a man who had been noticing the pattern for decades. The question is ancient. It keeps arriving in new clothing. And it arrives, still, every time you sit across a table from someone who sees the world in a way that baffles you, that seems to work by different rules than the ones you learnt to navigate by, and you find yourself wondering, not angrily, but with genuine curiosity. If you can manage it, what is it like to be inside that? What is the world like from there? That curiosity is the beginning of what Jung was pointing toward. Not the label, the curiosity. The willingness to look at the part of the compass you usually leave pointing at the floor. You are very close to sleep now, or you have already been there for a while, and some part of you is still listening, which is fine. The brain in sleep is not silent. It is busy in ways we do not fully understand, sorting and consolidating and connecting things that were separate during the waking hours, finding the shape of things that seemed shapeless when they were happening. Perhaps it will do that with some of what you heard tonight. Perhaps some thread of it will surface tomorrow in a form you did not expect. That is, in its small way, a little like what Jung was describing. The thing that works while you are not watching. The part that moves in the dark and brings something back. Grandpa would ask you one question before we close. Not a quiz, not a test, just something to carry if you want to carry it. Think of the thing you do most naturally, the mode you slip into when you are not thinking about it, the function that leads when you are at your best. And then think of its opposite. Not with judgment, just with curiosity. What would it be like to be a person for whom that opposite thing is natural? A person for whom what costs you nothing is work, and what costs you everything is easy? And is there someone in your life who lives that way? And does that explain anything? You do not have to answer tonight. Sleep is not for answers. Sleep is for the quiet accumulation of something that might, in time, become understanding. Enough stories for one night. Off to sleep now, Grandpa says.